There is a particular kind of silence that a fire leaves behind, not the silence of an empty field at dawn or the quiet of a church after the last hymn fades. No, this silence is heavier. It settles into the charred wood and the blackened earth like something that means to stay forever. It smells of loss. It tastes like the back of your throat after you've been crying and trying not to show it. That was the silence that greeted Nora Callahan the morning the westbound train dropped her at the Harlan Creek station in the autumn of 1882. She stood on the platform with 2 leather trunks, a carpet bag, and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft and frayed at the corners. The letter had described a ranch. 300 acres of good grazing land, a solid house with a porch that faced the mountains, a barn that could hold 20 head, and a man named Elias Cole who was, the letter said, steady and honest and in need of a wife to build a life alongside. What the letter had not said was that the house had burned to the ground 6 weeks before she arrived. She could see it from the station, or rather, she could see what remained of it. A foundation of pale stone, 2 walls still standing to about waist height like broken teeth, a chimney rising up from the ruin like the last thing that had refused to fall. And beside that chimney, sitting on a scorched timber with his hat in his hands, was a man she could only assume was Elias Cole. He had not come to meet her at the station. He had not sent anyone. She was told his name by the station master, who said it quietly and with a kind of pity that made her stomach tighten. She picked up her smallest bag and walked toward the ruins. And somewhere in those 2 trunks she had dragged across 3 states, there was something nobody in Harlan Creek knew about, something that would change everything if she let it. But first, she needed to understand who this man was, and what kind of woman she herself meant to be now that she had come so far and found so little standing. Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had been trying to become something bigger for 20 years and had mostly succeeded only in becoming older. The main street had a general store, a livery, a small church with a listing steeple, a saloon that did respectable business, a post office the size of a closet, and a sheriff who was pushing 60 and moved like it. There were maybe 300 souls in Harlan Creek and the surrounding land, and most of them had opinions about most things. The town had watched Elias Cole's fire from a distance. Nobody knew exactly how it started. Some said it was a lantern left burning in the front room. Some said it was the chimney, which had needed repointing for 2 seasons. Old Gerald Watts at the feed store said he'd seen lightning strike that direction the night it happened, though no one else recalled a storm. What the town agreed on was that Elias had gotten out with his life, his horse, his barn, and not much else. What the town did not agree on was what Elias Cole ought to do next. He was 38 years old. He had come to this part of Colorado 9 years earlier with a modest inheritance and enough stubbornness to fence 300 acres and grow a cattle operation that was small but honest. He had never married. He had come close once, a woman named Ruth Payne, but she had chosen a man from Pueblo who had a proper house already built and a future that did not require so much imagination. Elias had not spoken of it since, but the town remembered. The fire had left marks on him beyond the loss of the house. There was a long burn along his left forearm and another across the left side of his jaw and neck, the skin there pulled and shiny and strange-looking against the rest of him. He'd gone back in twice trying to save what he could. The second time he went in, the roof section over the back bedroom came down and caught him. He'd lived, he'd healed enough to walk and work. But the scars were plain and visible, and he knew people saw them before they saw anything else. He had written the letter to the agency in St. Louis 6 months before the fire, when loneliness had finally grown heavier than pride. The fire had come and gone. The woman, apparently, was still coming. He had thought about writing again to stop her. He hadn't. He wasn't entirely sure why. And so he was sitting on a scorched timber, turning his hat in his hands, when he heard footsteps on the ash-gray ground and looked up to find a woman standing over him who was not at all what he had imagined. Nora Callahan was 34 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes that took things in steadily, like she was cataloging the world before committing to a reaction. She was not small and she was not frail. She had a quality of stillness about her that was not coldness, more like the stillness of water that runs deep rather than fast. She looked at his burned house, she looked at him, she looked at the chimney. "You're Elias Cole," she said. "I am." He stood because his mother had raised him to stand. "I should have written again." "I meant to, why didn't you?" He turned his hat once more. "Couldn't think of a way to explain it that didn't sound like I was making excuses." She set her bag down on the cleanest piece of ground she could find. "How long ago did it burn?" "6 weeks." "And where have you been sleeping?" "The barn." She nodded just once, like that answered something beyond the simple question. She looked at the standing walls again, measuring them with her eyes. Then she said, "Is the stone foundation sound?" He blinked. "I believe so." "Then it's not nothing," she said. "It's a starting place." Elias Cole did not know what to make of her. He had expected tears or anger or the next train back east. He had not expected a woman who looked at the ruins of his home and started calculating. She stayed. That was the first thing the town noticed and talked about. The mail-order bride had arrived to a burned homestead and she had stayed. She took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Patsy Howell, who charged modest rates and asked few questions, though she listened carefully to every answer she happened to overhear. Nora paid for the room a month in advance, which made Patsy's eyes go quiet and curious, because a woman traveling on thin means did not usually pay a full month upfront in cash. Nora said nothing about where the money had come from. She only asked where she might find a reliable carpenter. In the days that followed, she walked out to the Cole property every morning. Sometimes Elias was already working. Sometimes she arrived first and stood in the ruins looking at the layout of the old foundation, making notes in a small leather journal she kept tucked inside her coat. She had a habit of pressing her hand flat against the stone walls that remained standing, as if she were reading something in them by touch. Elias watched her from a distance more than once before he understood it wasn't nosiness. She was studying the structure. She had an eye for it. "You've done this before," he said one morning, not accusing, just recognizing. She looked up from the foundation corner she'd been examining. "My father was a builder," she said. "Not a grand architect, practical buildings, houses mostly. I spent a lot of years handing him tools and listening." "Where is your father now?" She was quiet for a moment. "He died 4 years ago. Left me the business and a great deal of debt." She paused. "And then some other things that took time to sort out." She said it simply, without drama. And then she moved on to the next corner, and he understood that was all she meant to say about it for the time being. What she did not tell him was that sorting out her father's affairs had taken her to 2 lawyers, a courthouse in Philadelphia, and finally, after 18 months of quiet legal work, to the discovery that her father had been hiding something for 20 years. He had invested early in a railroad venture that most people considered foolish. He had never told her. He had borrowed against the house to do it, which was why she'd believed there was only debt after his death. But the venture had not been foolish. The returns had accumulated quietly in an account she hadn't known to look for, managed by a Philadelphia bank, and when she finally found it, the amount was enough to make her sit down on the floor of the lawyer's office and stay there for a while. She had not told the marriage agency. She had not told anyone. She had spent a year trying to decide what to do with the money, and she had finally concluded that what she did not want was to be known for it. She had seen what happened to women of means who were unmarried. They were courted for the wrong reasons, managed, diminished. She wanted to know that any life she chose for herself. And so she had written to the agency, and they had written back about a man in Colorado named Elias Cole. Now she walked through the ruins of his house every morning with her journal, and she helped him plan what might rise in its place, and she didn't tell him. Not yet. What she did tell him in those first quiet mornings were smaller things, that she preferred strong coffee to weak That she had grown up in a city and missed the sound of it sometimes and was surprised to find that the prairie wind filled a similar space. That she had never ridden a horse properly, but she had always wanted to learn. He told her smaller things in return, that he had 3 good cattle dogs and their names were Ira, Bess, and Drum. That the mountain to the north changed color at sunset in a way that never got ordinary. That the south pasture had a spring-fed pond that held water even in dry years, which was the most valuable thing on the property now that the house was gone. They were both careful with each other. Not cold, careful, like people who had been bruised enough by life to move with some deliberateness before committing their weight to anything. But there were mornings when the light came in at a certain angle and she would look up from whatever she was doing and catch him watching her, and he would not look away quite fast enough. And the silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one the fire had left. Harlan Creek as a town was both generous and insufferable, sometimes within the same afternoon, generous in that several of the townspeople had offered help after the fire. Walt Dunmore from the neighboring property had lent Elia's tools, the church had organized a collection. Patsy Howell had fed him supper every evening for 2 weeks without charging a cent. Insufferable in that everyone had a view about how Elia's coal ought to proceed, and most of those views were being formed, refined, and exchanged now that there was a woman in the picture. The central voice in this chorus was a woman named Vera Sandage, who had been the postmistress for 11 years and knew, therefore, everything that moved in or out of Harlan Creek by mail. She had read the outside of Nora's correspondence with the attention of a scholar. And she had noted the Philadelphia return addresses on letters that arrived in Nora's first weeks at the boarding house. Philadelphia money, Vera told anyone who would listen at the church social that second week. You can see it in the way she holds herself, and those trunks she arrived with weren't cheap. She's hiding something, maybe she's just private, said Patsy Howell, who had developed a quiet fondness for her boarder. Private and hiding are not the same thing, Vera said, except when they are. There was also the matter of a man named Calhoun Briggs. Briggs was a land speculator who had been watching the coal property for 2 years, since before the fire. He ran a small but effective operation of buying distressed properties in the region and reselling them, sometimes to legitimate buyers and sometimes in arrangements that were difficult to trace. He was a trim, well-spoken man of about 50 who wore clean suits and shook hands firmly and had a smile that arrived just a beat slower than you'd expect. Like it had to travel up from somewhere colder. After the fire, he had approached Elias with an offer for the land. Elias had refused without particular ceremony. Briggs had been politely persistent. Elias had been less polite the second time. Now, with a woman on the property and talk of rebuilding, Briggs had shifted his approach. He came to call on Nora at the boarding house one Thursday afternoon, presenting himself as a concerned neighbor and offering his condolences for her difficult arrival. And suggesting in his unhurried way that she might want to consider whether tying herself to a ruined homestead was truly in her best interest. Mr. Cole is a good man, he said over the tea Patsy had provided and clearly resented providing, but good men can be bad investments. That land has a lien on it, did you know? From the rebuilding costs he's already taken on. Nora looked at him across the tea table. I appreciate your concern, she said. I have a buyer who would pay fair market for the land, maybe above market. Mr. Cole could walk away solvent, start fresh somewhere smaller. And you, well, you wouldn't have to marry into a stone foundation and a barn. Is that all? She said. He smiled the slow smile. Just friendly advice. After he left, Patsy Howell said, that man's been trying to get that land since before the fire. Some people wonder if the fire was entirely an accident. Nora set down her cup carefully. Does Elias know that people wonder? Elias doesn't talk much about what people think. No, Nora said, mostly to herself. I suppose he wouldn't, she told him that evening. She walked out to the barn where he had made himself a functional if uncomfortable living arrangement, and she told him about Briggs's visit without dressing it up or leaving things out. He listened with his arms folded and his face very still. "He come to you instead of me," he said when she finished. "He thought I might be more manageable." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shape one makes just before a smile decides whether it's welcome or not. "Was he right?" "Not especially," she said. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me. There's something else," she said. "Patsy thinks the fire might not have been an accident." The stillness in his face became something harder and more considered. He didn't answer right away. The cattle dogs moved in the straw. Outside, a wind moved through the dark. "I've thought on it," he said finally. "I don't have proof of anything, but you've thought on it." "Yes." She stood there for a moment, then she said, "Then we should be careful." She said we. He noticed. He didn't say he noticed. But he noticed. October came in on a cold wind and the work on the foundation moved forward by small degrees. Elias had contracted with a carpenter from town named Pete Lassiter, a quiet man in his 60s who had built half the buildings in Harlan Creek and had opinions about every joint and beam. Nora worked alongside them. She drew plans in her journal, proposed solutions when problems came up, and was not shy about disagreeing with Pete when she thought he was wrong. Though she did it respectfully enough that Pete only argued back about half the time instead of all of it. Elias watched her work. He watched the way she thought through problems. He watched the way she spoke to Pete, to the hands who came to help, to the neighbors who stopped by to look. She was measured with everyone and warm with almost no one, and yet people were not put off by her. They respected the measure. He found himself looking for reasons to be near her. This alarmed him considerably. He was not a man who ignored his own heart, but he was a man who had learned the cost of hoping too soon. And there were things between them that had not been resolved, things that lived in the shape of their arrangement. She had come as a mail-order bride. That was a contractual kind of beginning, and he had always suspected that contractual beginnings bred contractual feelings, duty, obligation. The going through of motions because papers had been signed and trains had been boarded. He did not want that. He also did not know how to say that to her without it sounding like he was setting terms. The scars were part of it too, though he would not have easily admitted that. Before the fire, he had simply been a private and solitary man. After the fire, his face and arm told a story that strangers reacted to before they knew any other thing about him. He had watched people's eyes adjust. He had watched the particular kindness that is worse than unkindness because it requires you to pretend not to notice the effort. Nora had not done that. From the first day, she had looked at him the way she looked at the foundation stones, directly and with assessment and without performance. He didn't know what to do with that either. One afternoon, they were measuring the north wall, working side by side in the cold. And their hands reached for the same end of the measuring rope at the same moment, and her fingers closed over his and then released quickly. Neither of them said anything, but something had shifted and they both knew it, the way you know weather is coming before you can name the particular cloud. That night, alone in the barn, he sat with Ira at his feet and tried to figure out what kind of man he was going to be. Whether he was the kind who let fear of loss keep him at a careful distance from everything he might want. Or whether he was going to trust what he saw in her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching, which was something that looked, if he was honest with himself, very much like a woman deciding whether she was safe enough to feel something. He thought about what Pete Lassiter had said to him that afternoon offhand while they were fitting a crossbeam. Pete had said, "You know what that woman is doing out here every day, Cole. She's not building your house, she's deciding." Elias had asked what she was deciding. Pete had looked at him like he was mildly slow. "Whether you're worth staying for." The letter came on a Wednesday. It arrived addressed to Nora, care of the Harlan Creek Post Office. And Vera Sandage noted the Philadelphia Bank seal on the outside with the intensity of someone who has been waiting for confirmation of a theory. By the time Nora collected it that afternoon, Vera had already mentioned the seal to 3 people. Nora read the letter in Patsy's kitchen over a cup of coffee. It was from the bank, a routine accounting communication detailing the quarterly earnings on the account. The number was significant. The number was more than significant. Written out in the neat hand of a bank clerk, it was the kind of number that changed how people looked at you. She folded the letter and put it inside her coat. She sat for a while with her coffee getting cold. She had known this day would arrive, the day when the hidden thing stopped being hidden. She just hadn't known how it would happen or whether she would be ready. She had imagined herself choosing the moment. She had imagined it going carefully, thoughtfully, with context and preparation and the right words. What she had not imagined was Vera Sandage. By the following morning, the word was out that Nora Callahan's letter from a Philadelphia bank had carried a seal the size of a silver dollar. And speculation about its contents ranged from modest to extraordinary. By afternoon, the speculation had landed somewhere near extraordinary and stayed there. Calhoun Briggs heard it by evening. He was at the Cole property the next morning before 7 o'clock. He did not come to see Nora this time. He came to see Elias. Elias was checking fence line on the east pasture when Briggs found him. He arrived on a fine gray horse and sat it well, which was the only thing about Briggs that Elias had ever reluctantly admired. "I'll raise my offer," Briggs said. Considerably, Elias kept working on the fence, not interested. "You understand the financial position you're in, Cole, the rebuilding debt, the lien. If your bride has resources that could ease all of that, you're a fool not to see the opportunity clearly. If you've got something to say about Miss Callahan, say it plain." Briggs looked at the distant mountains. "A woman with that kind of money coming to a place like this, to a situation like yours, she didn't come out of charity. She came for a reason. And when she's ready to say what that reason is, you might find that you're the one who's been managed." Elias straightened and looked at him. "Get off my land," he said. Briggs went. He went with the air of a man who feels he has planted a seed and is content to let it grow. The seed found soil. Elias was not a suspicious man by nature, but he was a man who had been hurt by hope before, and what Briggs had said, beneath all the self-interest, contained a question that Elias already carried. Why had she come? What did a woman with resources in Philadelphia need with a burned-out homestead in Colorado? What was she deciding, as Pete had said, and what was the thing she hadn't told him yet? When she arrived that morning, he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She felt it immediately. "Something's wrong," she said. He kept working. "Elias." He stopped. He set down the timber he was carrying. He stood with the scar along his jaw, catching the cold morning light, and he said very quietly, "Is there something you meant to tell me?" She understood exactly what he meant. She sat down on the foundation wall. She took a breath. "Yes," she said, "there is." She told him everything: her father, the investment, the account, the amount. She told it plainly, the way she told most things, without decoration or apology. She told him why she hadn't said it from the beginning. She told him about the men who had courted her in Philadelphia after the discovery, what they had seen and what they had not. She told him she had wanted to be chosen for herself before being known for the money, and that she understood if that felt like deception, and that if it changed things between them, she would understand that too. When she finished, the wind moved through the ruined walls. Elias looked at the fire-blackened chimney for a long time. "Did you choose this place because you knew you could fix it?" he asked. "I chose this place because the letter described a man who was steady and honest," she said. "The money was already mine. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. A life costs something to build. I didn't think the money should be the first thing people knew about me, and now it is. Yes." Because of Vera Sandage and a bank seal, something happened in his face then. It was small, almost invisible, but she had been watching his face long enough to read it. He almost smiled. "Vera Sandage," he said, very quietly, with the particular resignation of a man who has lived in a small town long enough to know that there is simply no defense against certain forces of nature. She almost smiled back. It was a beginning. But it was also a place where everything could have broken apart, and they were both sitting on opposite sides of that line, and the next words one of them said were going to matter a great deal. "I wasn't going to tell you yet," she said honestly. "I wanted more time." "More time for what?" She looked at him steadily. "To know whether you were worth trusting." He was quiet. "And," he said. She looked at the rising walls of the new house taking shape around them, the stone and the new timber and the work they had done together in the cold. "I think you are," she said. The town had its field day, there was no preventing it. A mail-order bride with a Philadelphia fortune arriving to a burned homestead was simply too good a story for Harlan Creek to handle with restraint. It moved through the saloon, through the church, through the general store and the livery, gathering layers as it went. Some said the woman had come to buy up the land herself and Elias was a fool not to see it. Some said she was hiding from something, a bad marriage back east, a scandal, a crime. Old Gerald Watts said he'd always known that coal property had something special about it, and clearly a woman of means had recognized what a plain-looking man hadn't. Vera Sandage, to her mild credit, eventually admitted she didn't actually know what was in the letter. This admission came too late to slow anything down. Elias ignored most of it. Nora handled it differently. She went to the church social the following Saturday. She went alone without Elias, which surprised people. She wore a plain dress and sat with Patsy Howell and drank punch and spoke quietly with anyone who addressed her, and she neither confirmed nor denied most of what was being said. When Vera Sandage finally worked herself into proximity and asked directly whether the rumors about Philadelphia money were true, Nora said in her measured way, "My father was a builder who made a wise investment." "It isn't a scandal, Vera, it's just arithmetic." Vera had not expected to be called by her first name. She was briefly thrown off her game, which was all Nora had intended. What Nora accomplished that evening was something harder to name than simply managing gossip. She showed the town that she was not afraid of them, she was not defensive, she was not ashamed. She was a woman who had arrived at a difficult situation and intended to meet it on her own terms, and there was something about that. In a small town where people's lives were often shaped by what others thought, that people couldn't help but respect. The more complicated matter was between her and Elias. He had said she was worth trusting, she had said the same of him. But trust spoken aloud is still not the same as trust lived, and they were both aware of the distance that remained between what they felt and what they had agreed to become to each other. He came to supper at the boarding house that Sunday, at Patsy's invitation. The four of them, Patsy, Nora, Elias, and Pete Lassiter, who had been working all week and earned himself a hot meal, ate at the long kitchen table in the warmth of a wood stove. And it was the most ordinary evening Elias Cole had spent in a very long time. He watched Nora help clear the table. He watched her laugh at something Pete said, a real laugh, unpracticed, the kind that gets away from you before you decide to let it. He watched her stand at the window for a moment looking out at the dark street and press one hand against the cold glass, the same way she pressed her hand against the foundation stones. Reading something, always reading something, he stayed after Pete left. Patsy disappeared into the back with the particular tact of a good boarding house keeper. They sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the wood stove ticking down. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not sure I'll say it right, so I'd ask you to hear it through before you answer." She folded her hands on the table and waited. "I wrote that letter to the agency because I was lonely," he said. "I wasn't lonely for company exactly, I've never minded being alone in the usual way. I was lonely for someone who would look at this land and not see what it lacks, who would look at it and see what it could be." He stopped. "I thought I was asking for a practical arrangement. I think I was asking for something harder to name." She was very still. "The fire changed things," he said, "not just the house. I thought it might be God's way of telling me I'd asked for too much. And then you stepped off that platform and looked at what was left and said it was a starting place." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I don't know what you came here wanting. I know what you told me and I believe you. But I want to know if you can tell me honestly whether this is an arrangement you're honoring out of your word or whether it's something you'd choose again, knowing everything." He stopped. She looked at him for a long time. "I told you my father was a builder," she said slowly. "What I didn't tell you is that he built things in the wrong order all his life. He built the walls before the foundation was sound because he was impatient and he loved the visible part of the work. Half of what he built cracked eventually." She looked at the table. "I learned to do it right, foundation first, every time, no matter how long it takes." She looked up. "I've been building the foundation," she said quietly. He understood her completely. He reached across the table and laid his scarred hand over hers very carefully, like setting a bird down rather than catching one. She did not pull away. They sat there in the warmth of the wood stove for a long while without needing to say anything else. Calhoun Briggs made one final move in November. He filed a challenge to the deed on the coal property, claiming an irregularity in the original survey from 9 years prior. It was a legal maneuver rather than a sound claim, the kind of thing that costs money to fight even when the other side is clearly wrong, and he knew it. He had used it before on smaller landowners who couldn't afford the attorney fees to defend themselves. He had not accounted for Nora. She hired the best attorney available in Denver and paid the retainer without blinking. She also went quietly to Sheriff Ben Aldred, the aging lawman who moved like 60 but thought like 30, and she laid before him what she knew and what she suspected about the fire. She included in that conversation 2 pieces of information she had gathered carefully in the weeks prior, a conversation Patsy's nephew had overheard in the saloon 6 weeks before the fire, and a receipt she had found in the rubble of the coal house during the foundation work, a half-burned receipt for a quantity of lamp oil larger than any household would have needed. Sheriff Aldred listened to all of it with his hat on his knee and his eyes very still. He didn't move fast, but he moved surely, the way old lawmen do when they've decided something. Within 2 weeks, Calhoun Briggs had a conversation with the sheriff that left him pale and quiet, and a subsequent conversation with the attorney Nora had hired that left him considerably paler. The deed challenge was withdrawn. A separate investigation was opened regarding the origin of the fire, one that Briggs's lawyer advised him strongly not to interfere with. Briggs left Harlan Creek in December, before the investigation produced formal conclusions. In the manner of a man who has decided that other opportunities exist elsewhere and that the air in this particular town has become disagreeable. Elias learned the details of what Nora had done gradually, through Sheriff Aldred and Pete Lassiter, and finally from Nora herself. He learned that she had started collecting information about Briggs within the first weeks of her arrival, quietly and without drawing attention. Because she was the kind of woman who saw a threat and responded by understanding it before acting. He stood in the frame of the new front door, the house now roofed and walled if not yet finished inside, and he looked at her and shook his head slowly. "You've been busy," he said. "I had some concerns," she said. "You could have told me, you would have confronted him." "Yes, and he would have denied everything and become more careful. This way was better." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the new window openings and fell across the bare floor of the house she had helped design, on the foundation they had rebuilt together. The mountains to the north were doing the thing they did at this hour, changing color through shades that had no ordinary names. "Nora," he said. She turned from the window. "I would like to marry you," he said, "not because of the arrangement or the letters or any of that. I would like to marry you because you looked at the worst thing that ever happened to me and decided it was a starting place, and because you fight for what you love without making a show of it. And because I have not once in all these weeks seen you look at this." He touched the scar along his jaw briefly. The first time she had ever seen him acknowledge it directly and look away, she crossed the bare floor toward him. "I looked," she said. "I saw where you went back in twice." He was very still. "I thought," she said quietly, "that a man who goes back into a burning building twice trying to save what he loves is a man worth knowing considerably better." She reached up and laid her hand gently against the scarred side of his face. Not in pity, the way she laid her hand against stone, reading what was solid. "Ask me again in the spring," she said, "when the house is finished." He covered her hand with his. "Why the spring? Because then I'll have seen you through a winter and you'll have seen me through one, and we'll both know what we're saying yes to." He thought about that. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. Spring. They stood in the unfinished house as the last of the light went out of the mountains, and neither of them seemed to find the waiting anything other than exactly right. Spring came in March, early and green, with the pond on the south pasture glittering and the cattle fat from a mild winter and the 3 dogs chasing each other through the new grass in the south meadow. The house was finished on the inside by the end of February, Pete Lassiter having done his finest work on the woodwork and freely admitted it. The porch faced the mountains, as the old house had, and in the mornings the light hit it at an angle that was worth getting up early for. Nora and Elias were married by the Harlan Creek preacher on the first Saturday of April, in the church with the listing steeple. With Patsy Howell in the front row and Pete Lassiter directly behind her and Sheriff Aldred standing in the back because he was always more comfortable near a door. Vera Sandage cried. She cried earnestly and without apparent awareness of any irony, and afterward she told everyone it was the finest wedding Harlan Creek had seen in 20 years. Which was generous of her and not entirely false. Elias wore a clean suit and his good hat and stood at the front of the church with his hands very still at his sides and his scars in plain sight. And he did not look like a man who was bracing for something. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere. Nora walked down the aisle carrying a small bundle of early wildflowers that Elias had left on the boarding house porch that morning without a note. Because he was not a man who needed to write down what he meant when he could simply do it. She saw him and her measured stillness broke open just slightly, like a door giving way to warm air. And the look on her face when she reached him was a private thing that the whole church felt without being able to describe. The preacher said the words, they said yes. Outside, the prairie wind ran through the new grass and the mountains stood as they had always stood, patient and enormous and indifferent to small human arrangements and perfectly content, somehow, to witness them anyway. There is something this story keeps coming back to that deserves a moment's sitting with. A burnt homestead is not nothing. Nora Callahan said that the first morning she arrived, and she was right in more ways than she meant. The thing that fire leaves, the foundation, the stone that doesn't burn, the shape of what was there, that is also the shape of what can come again. And sometimes what comes again is better than what was there before, because it is built with more intention, with better understanding, with 2 sets of hands instead of 1. Elias Cole had spent years building alone. He had built well, and when the fire came, it took the visible part and left the bones. And into that loss came a woman carrying a hidden grace, not just the fortune her father had left her, but the patience to lay foundations before she built walls, the wisdom to choose slowly, and the courage to press her hand against a scarred face the way she pressed it against stone without flinching, reading what was solid. She had come to a burned place and decided it was a starting place. That is not a small thing. And he, the man who had gone back into the fire twice for the things he loved, who had sat in the ruins of his own life and turned his hat in his hands and waited without knowing what he was waiting for, he had stayed. He had not written to stop her. He had not sold the land or abandoned the stone or decided that losing the visible thing meant losing everything. He had sat on a scorched timber and turned his hat in his hands and waited, and she had walked toward him. That is perhaps all that love requires in its beginning. One person to stay and one person to walk toward them. The rest is foundation work, patient and unglamorous and absolutely everything. We hope this story found you in a warm place tonight, friends, wherever you're sitting. These old frontier tales remind us that second chances don't always look the way we expected them to. Sometimes they arrive at a burned-down house with 2 leather trunks and a carpenter's eye and a quiet kind of courage we don't quite have words for yet. Thank you for riding along with us here at Rusted Saddle Stories. If this one moved something in you, share it with someone who might need a good story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd sure be glad to have you. Until next time, keep writing.